Hi, I'm Susan Reigler with the Bourbon Women Association. Welcome to a very special tasting flight today. A lot of times when you're putting together a flight, you're trying to either compare styles, contrast styles, perhaps compare all cask-proof bourbons, perhaps all wheated bourbons. Maybe you're trying whiskeys that are all in the same proof and just seeing how they might differ in other aspects. Well, today our flight is especially fun because what all of these whiskeys have in common is that they are made at women-owned and in many cases women distiller-operated distilleries. And they're, interestingly, from around the US. So let's take flight and start with Virginia. This is Catoctin Creek. It is a rye from Purcellville, Virginia. Purcellville is in Loudoun County. It's about half an hour, 45 minutes out of Washington, D.C. It's not a very big place, but interestingly, I actually have been to Purcellville a couple of times because I have friends who live there. And just kind of shows you what a small world it is. So when I heard about Catoctin Creek, I knew exactly where the distillery was. It's owned by Scott and Becky Harris, and Becky is a chemical engineer by training, and she's the distiller. They make some lovely rye whiskeys, and this one, the mash bill, actually for all of their rye whiskeys, they use 100% rye, which is fairly unusual. Usually ryes are somewhere in the 60% of rye, and sometimes 50s, especially the Kentucky styles. So this 100% rye, lovely color, sort of a nice, polished bronze color. Very distinctly that rye, herbal rye note on the nose, which isn't terribly surprising. And let's give it a taste. It has some really nice butterscotch and spice in it too. And the palate matches the nose really, really well. This is Becky's Distiller Select. She sets aside about 10% of her barrels to make this. It's 92 proof, and it's just a very, very flavorful rye with a very long finish. Now, a very, very nice note of ripe peach there at the end on the finish. So definitely a rye worth seeking out. I know they're in several states now, not just Virginia. I know they're here in Kentucky and some other distribution as well. So keep a lookout for Catoctin Creek rye. Okay, then we're going to move on to Wisconsin. Liz Henry is one of the proprietors, one of the owners of J. Henry and Sons Distillery in Dane, Wisconsin. This is a family farm. Her husband is the proprietor of the farm. He's the farmer, and they've been growing their grains to make their whiskeys. They do some finished bourbons. They do straight bourbon. All of it is at least 5 years old, and I think it's really fun to know that the J. Henry and Sons whiskeys are very highly regarded, such that last time I was in Chicago, I went to the Palmer House. Actually, I was staying at the Palmer House, and when I went down to the lobby for an evening bourbon, I noticed that their private selections, they had Maker's Mark, they had Woodford Reserve, and they had J. Henry and Son private barrel selections. And I ordered in Liz's honor the J. Henry and Son bourbon. It's 94 proof, I believe. I'm going to have to double check. Actually, it's also 92. It's also 92. It is a 4-grain bourbon. It's made with corn and rye and wheat and malted barley, and has a very sweet nose. Of course, I just tasted a rye, so any bourbon is going to have a sweet nose. Lots of good caramel, some ripe apple, a little cinnamon. Just a beautifully balanced bourbon. And it's always interesting when you have the 4 grains. In fact, it's interesting we have another 4 grain as well, but we're not quite there yet. We're going to move on to Texas, to Myelin Green, and I know many of you remember Heather Green from coming to our Bourbon Women's Symposium in past years. And Heather is one of the partners in Myelin Green. She's their master blender. They have an interesting operation in that they do distill bourbon. Marlene Holmes from Kentucky, who used to work at Beam, is their distiller. And Heather is their master blender. So they are currently sourcing some whiskeys and making some whiskey. And so this is the triple cask from Myelin Green. It's triple because they have two different Tennessee bourbons that they are blending in this. One is 4 years old, and nope, 3-year-old, 3-year-old and 11-year-old Tennessee bourbons, and then a 2-year-old that they've distilled themselves at Myelin Green, which is in Blanco, Texas. It's about 40 miles outside of Austin. And this has a little spicier nose to it than the J. Henry and Sons. A little spicier, a little more herb. But very fruity, very caramel on the palate. Lots more fruit going on the palate. Again, another really nicely balanced bourbon. And then finally, we come to the Jephthah Creed, and this is made in Kentucky. It's made at the Jephthah Creed Distillery in Shelbyville, Kentucky. And again, I know that some of you know Joyce Nethery, who is one of the owners along with her husband and adult children. Her son and daughter, they're all involved in the business. He does the farming, and she does the distilling. She, like Becky Harris, has a chemical engineering degree, and she is the distiller for Jephthah Creed. And it's interesting that they use an heirloom variety corn that they grow called Bloody Butcher, and you can see it is a deep red color. It's kind of fun to watch in the fermentation process and the mash tub. The mash is kind of a pink color, which is pretty unusual. Obviously, you usually see that sort of golden corn color. Well, this is an interesting dark pink color. And as a matter of fact, the Henrys use Bloody Butcher in their whiskey as well. So we have another 4-grain with the corn and the wheat and the rye and the malted barley. A lot of fruit with some herbal undertones there, a little bit of that rye peeking out. And try the very much a kind of dry and some good oak, a little bit of ripe fruit, and that lovely kind of medley of the cereal grains. So you have 4 different whiskeys here, all created by, owned by women, and that's a pretty appropriate flight, I think, for a Bourbon Women event. So support some more Bourbon Women, seek out their whiskeys, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.